Maple Lane had always been my little slice of heaven. For 15 years, I watched the seasons change from my front porch, marking time by the growth of the oak trees we planted when we first moved in. Our neighborhood was the kind where children played in sprinklers during summer, neighbors helped shovel driveways in winter, and everyone gathered for the annual 4th of July barbecue. It was everything I had imagined when my husband and I saved for years to afford our first home. Our son, Michael, grew up in this house. His height mark still climbed the kitchen doorframe, stopping abruptly at 17 when he announced he was joining the Marines. I remember how proudly he stood that day, already carrying himself differently, as if the decision alone had transformed him. We were scared, of course, but mostly proud. So very proud. The neighborhood cheered him on when he left for boot camp. Mrs. Wilson from across the street baked cookies. Mr. Ramirez helped me hang a Blue Star Service flag in our front window. The sense of community made his absence easier to bear. Back then, our homeowners association was led by Jim Fletcher, a retired schoolteacher who understood that rules existed to preserve harmony, not destroy it. Everything changed 2 years ago when Jim moved to Florida. The board election should have been routine. Most of us did not even attend the meeting, a decision I would come to regret deeply. That was how Patricia Winters, Karen, as we all called her behind her back, became our HOA president. I first met her at the community mailboxes. She introduced herself with a clipboard already in hand, informing me that my mailbox numbers were half an inch smaller than regulation size. Before Karen, violation notices were rare occurrences typically reserved for abandoned cars or dangerously unmaintained properties. Within 6 months of her presidency, bright yellow citations appeared on doors throughout the neighborhood like a spreading virus. My first notice came for having garden hoses visible from the street. The second arrived because my garage door remained open for more than 30 minutes while I unloaded groceries. At first, many of us laughed it off. The pettiness seemed too absurd to take seriously. Then came the fines. The laughter stopped when elderly Mr. Peterson was charged $200 because his trash can remained at the curb until 8:30 p.m. instead of being removed by 7:00 p.m. on collection day. The retired widower lived on a fixed income. The fine represented nearly half his weekly grocery budget. I decided to speak up at the next HOA meeting. The community center that once hosted friendly gatherings now felt sterile and hostile. Karen sat at the center of the table, flanked by her 4 chosen board members. She wore her signature pearls and a navy blue blazer, like a judge presiding over a courtroom. When I raised concerns about the aggressive enforcement, Karen cut me off mid-sentence. "The bylaws exist for a reason," she said, not even looking up from her papers. "Property values depend on strict adherence to standards. If you do not like the rules, perhaps Maple Lane is not the right neighborhood for you." The room fell silent. I looked around for support but found only downcast eyes. People were afraid. Walking home that night, I noticed how the neighborhood had changed. Porch lights that once stayed on as friendly beacons now switched off precisely at 9:00 p.m. per Karen's energy conservation mandate. Gardens that once showcased personal creativity now conformed to the approved plant list. Neighbors who used to chat across driveways now hurried inside, afraid of being cited for excessive noise. The next morning, I found another violation notice on my door. This one stated my American flag was displayed incorrectly. I had hung that same flag in the same spot for 14 years without issue. The notice included a $75 fine and a warning that further infractions would result in escalating enforcement action. I held the yellow paper in my hand, watching as my son's Marine Corps photo smiled at me from the hallway table. Michael was on his second deployment. He was fighting for freedom halfway around the world while at home, We were losing hours one ridiculous rule at a time. Most people do not understand what a military uniform truly means. To civilians, it might look like just well-pressed clothes with some medals and patches. But to service members and their families, each thread carries the weight of tradition, sacrifice, and brotherhood. When Michael earned his dress blues after completing basic training, the transformation in his posture was immediate. He stood taller, his eyes reflecting a deeper understanding of responsibility that many people twice his age never achieve. The first time Michael wore his full dress uniform home, our neighbors gathered spontaneously in our driveway. Children stared wide-eyed at the polished brass buttons and the perfectly aligned medals. The adults shook his hand with new respect, seeing not the boy who once broke Mrs. Wilson's window with an errant baseball, but a United States Marine who had pledged his life to protect them all. After his first deployment, Michael carefully packed his dress blues before returning to base. "Keep these for me, Dad," he said, showing me precisely how the jacket should hang to maintain its shape. "They need to be ready when I come home." I built a special display area in the garage, visible through our small garage windows but protected from direct sunlight. Every morning when I pulled out of the driveway, that uniform reminded me of what my son was doing so far from home. 3 months into his second deployment, a package arrived from overseas. Inside, I found his worn utilities, the working uniform Marines wear daily in combat zones. These were different from his pristine dress blues. These carried the dust of foreign lands, faint sweat stains that would not wash out, and a small tear on the sleeve that had been carefully mended. A handwritten note accompanied them. "These have seen me through some tough days. Keep them safe until I get back, would you? Love, Michael." That night, I hung the utilities beside the dress blues, creating a display that told the story of my son's service, both the ceremonial glory and the gritty reality. The sight of those uniforms standing sentinel in my garage gave me strength during the long months of his absence. Each morning, I would touch the sleeve of his utilities before leaving for work, a silent ritual that helped me feel connected to him across thousands of miles. Karen began her campaign against me the week after I spoke up at the HOA meeting. The violation notices increased to twice weekly. My shrubs were 1 inch taller than permitted. My recycling bin was visible from the street. My wind chimes violated the noise ordinance. Each notice came with Karen's signature, her handwriting growing increasingly bold with each citation, as if she took personal pleasure in finding new infractions. Then came the demand for a garage inspection. The notice cited a need to verify compliance with storage regulations. Though my instincts screamed to refuse, the HOA bylaws did permit inspections with 48-hour notice. Fighting it would only escalate the situation. I reluctantly agreed to the inspection, scheduled for Tuesday at 10:00 a.m. Karen arrived at 9:45, clipboard already filled with pre-checked violation boxes. She wore a tight smile that never reached her eyes as she stepped into my garage. I watched her scan the space methodically until her gaze locked onto the uniform display. Something in her expression changed, a flash of triumph, as if she had found exactly what she was looking for. "What is that?" she asked, pointing her pen at the uniforms. "Those are my son's Marine Corps uniforms," I replied, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "He is deployed overseas right now." Karen stepped closer, examining them with cold calculation. Section 12. Paragraph 3 of the bylaws clearly states that no clothing items may be visible in garages from exterior windows. This creates an unsightly appearance and lowers property values. I stared at her in disbelief. "These are not clothes. These are military uniforms." Karen flipped through her clipboard papers. "The bylaws make no distinction. Clothing items must be stored in approved containers or behind cabinet doors. She scribbled on her violation form. You have 7 days to remove these items from view, or you will face a $100 daily fine. She handed me the violation notice, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. The red stamp across the top read, "Final Warning" in bold letters. Karen stepped back, adjusting her pearl necklace with satisfaction. "This is my son's military uniform," I repeated, my voice rising. "He is serving our country right now." "Rules are rules," Karen replied flatly. 7 days. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving me holding the notice, staring at the uniforms that meant everything to my son and apparently nothing to her. The morning after Karen's inspection, I called the HOA management company to appeal the violation. The representative sounded sympathetic but ultimately powerless. "The board has final authority on interpretation of the bylaws," she explained. "I can note your objection, but enforcement decisions rest with the HOA president." I spent that afternoon researching HOA regulations, looking for any protection for military families or exemptions for service-related displays. Finding nothing concrete, I decided to approach my neighbors for support. Surely they would understand the importance of respecting a deployed Marine's uniform. The responses shattered my remaining faith in our community. The Johnsons, whose son had played baseball with Michael throughout high school, peered nervously past their barely opened door. "We really cannot get involved," Mr. Johnson whispered. "Last month, we challenged a violation and ended up with 3 more the following week." The door closed softly, followed by the definitive click of the deadbolt. Similar scenes played out at 6 more houses. People who had attended Michael's graduation party, who had signed his deployment card, who had promised to look out for me while he was gone, all now too afraid to stand against Karen and her reign of bureaucratic terror. By day 3, the first fine notice arrived, $100 for noncompliance. By day 5, another $200. On day 7, the total reached $500 with a note indicating the fines would continue to accumulate until the violation was corrected. My teacher's salary made these amounts significant, but the principle mattered more than the money. Moving those uniforms felt like betraying my son. I called Michael's commanding officer, explaining the situation. He expressed outrage but could offer little help from thousands of miles away. "Military uniforms are protected from certain local ordinances," he said, "but HOA bylaws fall into a gray area legally. Document everything and hold your ground if you can." On day 10, with $800 in fines accumulated, a certified letter arrived. The HOA board had voted unanimously to exercise their right to abate the violation themselves if I did not comply within 24 hours. The letter cited Section 18 of the bylaws, which granted them authority to enter the property and remove rule violations, then bill the homeowner for the service. I called our family attorney, who reviewed the bylaws and delivered devastating news. "They do have this authority," he confirmed. "You can fight it later in court, but they can legally enter your garage if you have been properly notified." The only suggestion he offered was to remove the uniforms myself before they took action. That night, I sat in my garage for hours, staring at Michael's uniforms, the physical embodiment of his service and sacrifice. The dress blues still held the shape of his shoulders. The utilities carried the faint scent of far-off desert sand. How could I explain to my son that I had hidden away the symbols of his courage because of petty neighborhood politics? I had just decided to stand my ground regardless of consequences when my phone rang. My sister's voice sounded panicked on the other end. "Mom fell in the bathroom. They are taking her to Memorial Hospital. The doctors think she broke her hip. She lived 3 hours away, and I was her only other family. I had no choice but to go immediately. In my rush to pack an overnight bag and arrange care for the house, a critical thought slipped my mind. I forgot to close the interior door between the kitchen and the garage, the door that remained unlocked because it was inside my home. Looking back, that single oversight would change everything. I spent 26 hours at the hospital with my mother. Her surgery went well, but I stayed until she was settled in her recovery room. Exhausted, I pulled into my driveway just after dusk the following day. Everything looked normal until I entered the kitchen and felt a cool breeze. The door to the garage stood open. My heart hammered in my chest as I flipped on the garage light. The display area where the uniforms had hung for years was empty. Only bare hangers remained, swinging slightly in the draft from the open door. A neatly printed notice was taped to the wall. Violation abated per Section 18 of HOA bylaws. Service fee of $150 will be added to your account. A wave of nausea hit me as I stumbled back into the kitchen. Where had they taken Michael's uniforms? Had they stored them somewhere? The HOA office was closed at this hour. I would have to wait until morning to demand answers. Unable to sleep, I left the house at dawn to walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. As I passed the community park, something in the fire pit caught my eye, a glint of metal reflecting the early morning sun. Drawing closer, I felt my legs nearly give out beneath me. In the pit lay the charred remains of fabric, unmistakably the distinctive blue of Marine dress uniforms. Brass buttons, blackened by flames but still recognizable, were scattered among the ashes. The eagle, globe, and anchor emblem, the sacred symbol of the Marine Corps, was partially melted but intact enough to identify. They had not just removed the uniforms. They had destroyed them, burned them like trash. The world tilted sideways as I fell to my knees beside the fire pit. With trembling hands, I gathered what remained of my son's uniform, each charred fragment a knife to my heart. His utilities, which had protected him in combat zones, and his dress blues, which he had worn with such pride, both reduced to ashes by people who had never served a day in their lives. I clutched the damaged emblem to my chest as tears streamed down my face. How would I tell my son that while he protected strangers abroad, the people at home had desecrated the very symbol of his service? The walk from the community fire pit to Corinne's house passed in a blur of rage and grief. My hands clutched the plastic bag containing the remains of Michael's uniforms, a pitiful collection of ashes, melted buttons, and scorched fabric. The morning was quiet, with only the occasional chirp of birds oblivious to the desecration that had occurred in their peaceful park. Corinne answered her door in a silk bathrobe, coffee cup in hand. Her expression shifted from annoyance to calculated neutrality when she registered who stood on her doorstep. "What precisely do you think you are doing at this hour?" she asked, blocking the entrance with her body. I held up the bag of ashes. "You burned my son's uniforms." The HOA removed a violation after multiple warnings and appropriate legal notice, she replied, her voice mechanically even. The items were considered abandoned property once removed. Abandoned? My son is serving overseas. These uniforms were his property. My voice grew louder with each word. Corinne's face remained impassive. The violation notices were clear. You had ample time to comply. When abatement became necessary, the items were processed according to procedure. Processed? They were military uniforms. You burned them in the community fire pit like garbage. A neighbor's curtain twitched in my peripheral vision. Corinne noticed too and lowered her voice. It was just following procedure. If you have a complaint, you can submit it in writing to the board. Now, I must ask you to leave my property before I report this as harassment." She closed the door before I could respond. I stood there, the bag of ashes heavy in my hands, realizing that in Corinne's world, rules and procedures trumped all human decency. The realization left me cold despite the morning sun warming my back. My next stop was the police station. Officer Reynolds had known our family for years. He had even written Michael a recommendation letter for his military application. His face darkened as I explained what had happened and showed him the remains of the uniforms. "This is destruction of property," I insisted. "It has to be illegal." Officer Reynolds sighed heavily, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "The problem is the HOA bylaws you signed when you bought the house. Section 18 does give them authority to remove violations after proper notice, but not to destroy personal property, surely." He grimaced. "The bylaws also state that items removed during abatement are considered abandoned if not claimed within 48 hours, since they removed them while you were away." He trailed off, his expression conveying what words could not. Legally, they had found a loophole. "So they can just burn a United States Marines uniform, and there is nothing we can do about it." "I will file a report," he offered, "and there might be other avenues to pursue. The Service Members Civil Relief Act provides some protections, though I am not sure if it covers this exact situation." I left the station with a police report that acknowledged the incident but offered no real recourse. The weight in my chest grew heavier with each step toward home. That evening, I had a scheduled video call with Michael. For hours beforehand, I rehearsed what to say, searching for words that could possibly explain what had happened to his uniforms. When his face appeared on the screen, smiling despite the poor connection and the exhaustion evident in his eyes, my carefully prepared speech evaporated. "Hey, Dad, great to see you. How is everything at home?" I took a deep breath. "Michael, something happened that I need to tell you about." His smile faded as I recounted the events, the HOA violations, the escalating fines, the threats, and finally, the burning of his uniforms. I tried to speak factually, to control the emotion in my voice, but when I mentioned finding the charred remains in the fire pit, my voice broke. Michael was silent for so long that I thought the connection had frozen. Then I noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the controlled breathing, techniques they taught Marines to manage intense emotions in high-stress situations. "Are you okay, Dad?" he finally asked, his voice steady. The question caught me off guard. His uniforms had been destroyed, and he was asking if I was okay. "I should be asking you that," I replied. "I failed to protect something important to you." "You did not fail," he said firmly. "Those people failed to understand what that uniform represents." He paused, something hardening in his expression. "Do you still have the ashes and whatever survived?" I nodded. "I collected everything I could find." "Keep them," he said. "This is not over." After the call ended, I sat in the dark living room for hours, replaying Michael's words. This is not over. His quiet resolve had awakened something in me. If I could not undo what had been done, perhaps I could still ensure justice for my son. The next morning, I began researching in earnest. Not just HOA bylaws, but state laws governing homeowners associations, federal protections for service members, and precedents for abuses of power. I printed articles, highlighted statutes, and filled a notebook with observations. Sleep became secondary as I built my case against the HOA board. 3 days into my research, a knock at the door interrupted my work. I opened it to find Jim Harris, a neighbor from 4 houses down whom I knew only in passing. He wore a formal button-down shirt despite the weekend, and his posture was remarkably straight for a man in his 60s. "May I come in?" he asked, glancing discreetly up and down the street. "I heard what happened to your son's uniforms." I hesitated, wary of neighbors after so many had turned away from me. "I was a JAG officer for 22 years before retiring," he added quietly. "That is a military lawyer, and I think I can help you fight back." For the first time since finding the ashes in the fire pit, I felt a spark of hope. I opened the door wider and invited him inside. Jim Harris transformed my dining room into a war room within hours of his arrival. My scattered research now found structure under his experienced guidance. He brought his own files, decades of legal knowledge organized into neat folders with color-coded tabs. "HOAs operate like tiny kingdoms," Jim explained, spreading documents across the table. "They have legitimate authority in many areas, but they often overstep because most homeowners do not understand the limits of that authority." We worked methodically, beginning with the HOA's own documents. Jim identified multiple procedural violations in how the board had conducted business over the past year. Meeting minutes were incomplete. Budget allocations lacked proper documentation. Worst of all, the election that had brought Corinne to power did not meet the quorum requirements specified in the bylaws. "They scheduled the election during spring break when many families were away," Jim noted, tapping a calendar. "Only 18% of homeowners voted. The bylaws require at least 25% for valid board elections." I stared at him. "Are you saying Corinne is not legitimately the HOA president?" "Technically correct, but challenging it after 2 years would be difficult," he admitted. "However, it establishes a pattern of procedural manipulation that strengthens our case." Our next discovery was even more damning. The HOA financial records, which were supposed to be available to all members upon request, revealed troubling discrepancies. The professional landscaping budget had tripled under Corinne's leadership, with the primary contractor being a company owned by her brother-in-law. Similar conflicts of interest appeared throughout the budget. "This is misappropriation of HOA funds," Jim said, his expression grim. "Possibly fraud, depending on what a forensic accountant might find." While Jim focused on the legal angles, I began documenting the human cost of Corinne's regime. I created a spreadsheet tracking all known violations issued during her presidency. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain homeowners received multiple citations, while properties with similar issues, but owned by Corinne's friends, remained violation-free. Elderly residents and single-parent households seemed particularly targeted, perhaps because they had less capacity to fight back. Mrs. Tang, the elderly widow at the corner, had received 14 citations in 18 months. Mr. Gonzalez, a single father of 3 who worked 2 jobs, had accumulated over $2,000 in fines for infractions like holiday decorations exceeding permitted time period and unauthorized wind chime installation. Each night, I updated Michael on our progress during our video calls. The satellite connection from his deployment location was often spotty, but his determination never wavered. After hearing about the financial discrepancies, he made a suggestion that would prove crucial. "Dad, the Marines take care of their own," he said, the video freezing momentarily on his serious expression. "I have been talking with some people here. Help is coming, but we need to time this right." Michael did not elaborate further, and I did not press. Having spent 15 years as a Marine parent, I had learned that when Marines plan something, it is best to trust the process. With Jim's guidance, I began approaching neighbors, carefully, selectively, one household at a time. We started with retired military families who would understand the significance of what had happened to Michael's uniforms. Next came those who had experienced the harshest treatment under Corinne's leadership. Each conversation was conducted in absolute privacy, often in backyards or garages where prying eyes could not observe. The stories we collected painted a disturbing picture of community life under Corinne's rule. The Andersons had been fined because their autistic son's therapeutic sensory garden did not conform to approved landscaping plans. The Richardsons faced threats of legal action when their daughter's wheelchair ramp was deemed an unauthorized structure, despite its necessity and professional installation. She threatened to put a lien on my house because my Christmas lights stayed up 3 days too long, Mrs. Wilson confided, her hands shaking as she spoke. My husband had just been hospitalized with pneumonia. Taking down lights was the last thing on my mind. As our evidence mounted, so did community support, silent but growing stronger each day. Neighbors began sharing documents, photographs, and personal testimonies. Mr. Davis, who worked in accounting, volunteered to analyze the financial records more thoroughly. Mrs. Peterson, a former court reporter, offered to document testimonies professionally. 6 weeks into our investigation, Jim presented me with a thick folder containing our completed case. "We have enough to challenge the entire board," he said. "Financial impropriety, procedural violations, selective enforcement, abuse of authority, and in the case of your son's uniforms, potential violations of federal law protecting service members." "What about the uniform specifically?" I asked. "Is there legal recourse for that?" "The Service Members Civil Relief Act provides certain protections, but this situation falls into somewhat uncharted territory," Jim admitted. "However, destroying the personal property of an active duty service member without proper due process could potentially trigger federal interest." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Typically, these meetings drew only board members and perhaps 2 or 3 homeowners. We planned to change that dramatically. Jim handled the legal notifications, formal letters to the board announcing our intent to present grievances and evidence of misconduct. I coordinated the community response, ensuring that every household that had suffered under Corinne's leadership knew when and where to appear. Michael's final video call before the meeting was brief but significant. "Everything is set on our end," he said, "the connection better than usual. Just make sure you present all the evidence exactly as planned. The timing must be perfect." "What exactly are you planning?" I asked. My son smiled, the confident smile of a Marine with a mission. "Justice, Dad, we are planning justice." The night before the meeting, I stood in front of the wall where we had organized our evidence. What had begun as grief and rage had transformed into something powerful. A community reclaiming its voice, neighbors standing together against tyranny disguised as rule enforcement, and a father ensuring that his son's service would be honored rather than desecrated. I carefully packed the charred remains of Michael's uniform into a clear display case that Jim had provided. These ashes would not remain hidden in shame. They would become evidence of overreach and the catalyst for change. The Maple Lane Community Center had never seen attendance like this. By 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled HOA meeting, every chair was filled. Neighbors stood along the walls, shoulder to shoulder. The room designed to hold 50 people now accommodated nearly 90. The air hummed with nervous energy and purposeful silence. Corinne and her board members arrived precisely at 7:00 p.m., their usual punctuality a point of pride. They faltered momentarily upon seeing the packed room. I watched Corinne's eyes widen, then narrow as she assessed the situation. Her board members exchanged uneasy glances, but they proceeded to the front table with manufactured confidence. "This is unexpected attendance," Karen said into the microphone, her voice betraying only slight tension. "We appreciate your interest in community governance, but must remind everyone that resident comments are limited to 3 minutes per household and only after regular business is concluded." Jim Harris stood immediately. "Point of order, Madam President. According to Section 5 of the bylaws, any agenda item may be amended by motion from the floor if supported by 10% of attending members." Karen's fingers tightened around her gavel. "We have a full agenda today. Amendments would be disruptive to established proceedings." "Nevertheless, it is our right under the bylaws," Jim persisted. "I move to amend today's agenda to address urgent community concerns before regular business." "I second the motion," called Mrs. Tang, standing with the aid of her cane. "All those in favor of amending the agenda, please raise your hands," Jim instructed. In a show of solidarity that brought tears to my eyes, every hand in the audience rose simultaneously. The board members sat frozen, confronted with the visual evidence of their community's united opposition. Karen cleared her throat. "It seems we must adjust our agenda. You have the floor for 15 minutes. "The community requests adequate time for full presentation of findings," Jim countered. "Given the severity of the issues, we require a minimum of 30 minutes. A muscle twitched in Karen's jaw as she consulted with other board members in hushed tones. Finally, she nodded curtly. 30 minutes, not a second more." I approached the podium carrying 2 items: the clear case containing the remains of Michael's uniforms and a thick binder of evidence. Setting both on the table, I faced my neighbors directly rather than addressing the board. "For 15 years, I have been proud to call Maple Lane my home," I began. "Like many of you, I believed our HOA existed to maintain community standards and property values. Under previous leadership, that was true. Rules were enforced with common sense and compassion." I opened the clear case, carefully lifting the charred eagle, globe, and anchor emblem. 2 months ago, this HOA board ordered the removal and subsequent burning of my son's Marine Corps uniforms. My son, who is currently deployed overseas, serving our country. They classified his uniforms as a violation because they were visible in my garage. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience. "This emblem survived the burning," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "It represents everything my son stands for: honor, courage, commitment. Values that seem forgotten in how this HOA now operates." For the next 20 minutes, Jim and I presented our findings methodically. We projected financial records showing questionable contracts awarded to Karen's relatives. We displayed side-by-side photographs proving selective enforcement of bylaws. We distributed copies of the original HOA covenant, highlighting sections that emphasized community well-being over punitive enforcement. Mr. Davis then presented his financial analysis, pointing to specific transactions that raised serious concerns about misappropriation of funds. "The landscaping budget increased by 340% over 2 years, he explained. "Yet our common areas show no improvement commensurate with this expenditure." Throughout our presentation, Karen repeatedly checked her watch, her expression growing increasingly rigid. When our allotted 30 minutes approached, she reached for her gavel with obvious relief. Jim stepped forward for our final point. "Before we conclude, we must address the specific legal violations committed in the destruction of an active duty service member's property." That matter has been resolved according to HOA procedures, Karen interrupted. The violation was properly documented and abated after adequate notice. The Service Members Civil Relief Act provides specific protections, Jim countered. Furthermore, the destruction rather than storage of removed items violates both HOA bylaws and state property law. Karen stood abruptly. This meeting has devolved into baseless accusations and emotional manipulation. The board has followed all proper procedures. This meeting is adjourned. She brought the gavel down with unnecessary force. The sharp crack echoed through the room, followed immediately by another sound, the measured cadence of footsteps approaching from the hallway. The double doors at the back of the community center opened in perfect synchronization. Every head turned as United States Marines in dress blue uniforms filed into the room. They moved with disciplined precision, forming a line along the back wall. Their faces remained impassive, but their presence commanded immediate respect. The room fell into absolute silence. The formation parted to allow passage for a distinguished officer whose chest carried rows of ribbons and decorations. He walked unhurriedly to the front of the room, stopping directly before the board table. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly without the microphone. "I am Colonel James Maxwell, representing the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the United States Marine Corps. We understand there has been an incident involving the property of Lance Corporal Michael Harrison, currently deployed with the 1st Marine Division." Karen's face had lost all color. "This is a private homeowners association meeting. You have no jurisdiction here." Colonel Maxwell smiled politely. "Ma'am, when it concerns the rights and property of our active duty personnel, you might be surprised where our jurisdiction extends." He placed a folder on the table. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act is quite clear on protections afforded to those serving our nation." The colonel turned to address the room. "Lance Corporal Harrison sends his regards. He wanted to be here personally, but, as you know, he has other duties at present. However, he asked that his brothers and sisters in arms represent him today." Karen's composure finally cracked. "This is intimidation. You cannot simply march in here and—" "Ma'am," the colonel interrupted with calm authority, "we are not here to intimidate. We are here to discuss a federal matter concerning one of our Marines. Now, shall we proceed with that discussion in this public forum, or would you prefer a more private setting where we can address the potential federal charges?" The room remained silent, every eye fixed on Karen as the full weight of her actions, and their consequences, finally registered on her face. Colonel Maxwell's explanation was delivered with the measured precision that defined Marine Corps communication. He outlined how the Service Members Civil Relief Act protected active duty military personnel from certain civil proceedings while deployed. The destruction of personal property belonging to a service member without proper legal process constituted a potential federal offense. The